On the night of June 5, 1944, General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, took a pencil and scribbled a few sentences on a piece of paper. The note began, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Le Havre area have failed to achieve a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops." He followed up with something even more revealing. "If any fault is attributed to the attempt, it is mine alone." That paper should not exist. And yet there he was, hidden in his uniform pocket as the first waves of soldiers touched the Normandy sand. He even put the date wrong. He wrote July 5th instead of June 5th. An insignificant mistake in the context of what was at stake. But nerves are nerves, even if you're the man in command of the most ambitious military operation in human history. That note existed because failure was perfectly possible, likely even under other circumstances. And if those early hours of June 6, 1944 had ended differently, the world we know today would be unrecognizable. This is what would have happened. The Atlantic Wall was a carefully maintained lie. Adolf Hitler had presented it to his generals and to the world as an impenetrable wall, thousands of kilometers of concrete steel turrets, mines and cannons that stretched from northern Norway to the Spanish Pyrenees. The propaganda described it as a Festung Europe, a Europe fortress. But when General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel was sent in January 1944 to personally inspect these defenses, what he found horrified him. Rommel concluded that the Atlantic Wall was at best 18% complete. 18%. The rest was facade, empty space, positions without artillery, bunkers without equipment, incomplete minefields. The Atlantic was not a wall. It was a broken promise struck in the imagination of those who had never bothered to verify reality. Rommel understood immediately. He had a clear diagnosis from the first round. And from that moment on, a race against time began to strengthen the coastal positions, install underwater obstacles, bury mines on the beaches, reinforce the Widerstands nester, the nests of resistance that were supposed to do the work that concrete had not done. The problem was that the resources arrived in dribs and drabs. The Eastern Front consumed them at industrial speed, and the weather did not wait. Rommel had argued before the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the German Armed Forces, that the only chance of repelling an Allied invasion was to do so on the beach itself in the early hours, before the enemy could consolidate a foothold. Once the Allies had a firm foothold on French soil, he claimed, the war was lost. He directly cited his experience in North Africa. Allied air superiority would destroy any armored counterattack before it reached the front lines. The panzer divisions had to be close enough to intervene in the first 12 hours. If they waited for more, they would never arrive. But Rommel's vision wasn't the only one on the table. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, had an opposite philosophy. Von Rundstedt believed that the Allies should be lured inland before crushing them with a massive armored reserve. A devastating counterattack inland, not a beach defense. The dispute between the two men came directly to Hitler, who settled the debate with the most bureaucratically futile solution possible. He divided the command of the armored divisions between Rommel, von Rundstedt, and the Führer himself. None of the three had complete authority over all the forces. And so, in the early morning of June 6, 1944, the panzer divisions capable of destroying the landing in its first hours were scattered in three commands with different activation rules in positions that were not optimal, waiting for orders that sometimes had to pass through the desk of a sleeping Hitler. The 21st Panzer Division, the closest to the beaches of Normandy, was based near Caen. He was perfectly capable of counterattacking in the first few hours, but it did not move with the necessary speed, partly because of command confusion, partly because of British operations sending gliders with Tetrarch light tanks behind their lines led them to believe that the Allies were trying to surround them. The Tetrarchs were in practice scrap with an engine, a vehicle that any armored expert would have discarded in seconds. But the tactical confusion of the moment did the job that the Tetrarch could never have done in real combat. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division, the deadliest available, were far enough away that it needed hours or even a full day to reach the beaches. And as they advanced, the Allied Air Force hunted them down. Every column that moved during the day was a target. In addition, Army Group Pas-de-Calais held its divisions in position for weeks after the landings, convinced that Normandy was a diversionary maneuver and that the real attack would come over the Strait of Calais. The Allied deception operation, known as Operation Fortitude, had created a ghost army called the 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, positioned in southern England off the Pas-de-Calais. Reports of double agents, fake radio messages, and cardboard and inflatable rubber vehicles convinced German intelligence that Normandy was diversion. But let's imagine that all this was different. Imagine that a combination of circumstances upset the balance enough for the landings to fail. The first to know would have been Bradley. General Omar Nelson Bradley, commanding the First Army of the United States, observed the reports from the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, anchored about 22 kilometers off the Normandy coast. What came from Omaha? Clippings of radio messages, liaison reports, reports from naval observers, painted a picture that bordered on disaster from the first light of dawn. The B-24 Liberators, sent to saturate the German positions during the night, had dropped their charges between 90 seconds and 5 minutes late, terrified of hitting their own vessels. The bombs fell up to 5 kilometers inland, where there was no enemy position of importance. The German defenses were left intact, the wider Stanz-Nester resistance nests, 15 concrete positions with MG-42 machine gun mixers, 88mm PAK, 43 anti-tank pieces embedded in the flanks of the ravines, and pre-calibrated artillery on every meter of the beach, opened fire on the first landing craft at the first ray of light. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, part of Major General Charles Gerhardt's 29th Infantry Division, made landfall in the Dog Green sector at about 6:30 a.m. He lost almost 90% of his men in the first minutes. None of his 4 officers survived the first hour. The survivors crawled under the icy water of the canal behind the steel obstacles, the so-called Belgian gates, metal gates almost 3 meters high, that paradoxically offered them the only coverage available at beach level. Of the 741st Armoured Battalion, the 32 Sherman DD tanks, duplex drive, 25-ton armoured vehicles equipped with waxed canvas flotation screens and rear propellers that were launched into the water 5,500 meters from shore, only 5 made it ashore. The other 27 sank in a matter of minutes under the 5-foot-tall waves generated by the canal's swell that morning. The canvas screens, designed to withstand 45-centimeter waves, simply didn't hold up. The crew, trapped inside or battling currents in the water at 4 degrees Celsius, died or were rescued before reaching the beach. The 743rd Battalion made the decision to take its tanks directly to shore in the transport boats, and some arrived. But as soon as they landed, they concentrated German fire on them. By the afternoon of June 6th, there were only 5 operational tanks left in the entire Omaha sector. At 8:30 a.m., the Omaha Beachmaster, the naval officer responsible for managing vessel traffic, notified Rear Admiral John Jimmy Hall, who commanded the 04 ships, that they had halted the advance of the reinforcement waves. The invasion of Omaha had been going on for 2 hours and was already at a standstill. Bradley, from Augusta, knew it. In his memoirs, published in 1983 with Clay Blair under the title A Soldier's Life, he confesses that he seriously contemplated evacuating the beachhead and directing the follow-up troops towards Utah Beach or the British beaches. A decision that, according to most military historians, would have proved catastrophic. The 4th Division, already landed in Utah, would have received upon it the burden of 2 additional divisions in already saturated terrain with no coordination time, with maps of another beach and written orders for a different sector. But in the real world, by 9 o'clock in the morning, though Bradley still didn't know it from his cruise, Soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One with veterans from Tunisia and Sicily, had penetrated German defences at least 7 distinct points and neutralised 5 of the 12 coastal resistance nests. Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cotter, assistant commander of the 29th Division, toured the beach under fire, telling soldiers paralysed in the sand, "There are 2 kinds of men on this beach, the dead and the ones who are going to die. Let's get out of here." By noon, the Vierville sector was in American hands. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Colleville corridor was beginning to open. Bradley did not give the order to withdraw. In our scenario, he gives it. At 9 o'clock in the morning, instead of the report informing him of the advances of the Big Red One, Bradley receives confirmation that the first wave has been practically annihilated, that the second wave is accumulating in the water without being able to land, and that the fire of the German 352nd Infantry Division, which no one expected to find in Omaha because Allied intelligence placed it 40 kilometers inland, shows all the signs of having been reinforced during the night with the troops that Admiral Kirk could not neutralize with naval bombardment. The order to withdraw arrives at 9:15 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Survivors are evacuated under continuous fire. Rescue vessels take direct hits. In Utah and on British beaches, the operation continues without knowing yet what has happened in Omaha. But the whole is irreparable. The front, which was to be continuous, has a gap of 15 kilometers between the American and British flanks. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, which in reality took 2 days to reach the front by the Allied aircraft attacking its columns during the day, took advantage of the absence of pressure on the western flank and consolidated positions between Bayeux and the sea. By sunset, the news has spread. By the next day, the whole world knows. The dead on the beach, between 2,000 and 5,000 in the first hours according to conservative estimates of American military historiography, stay where they fell. The sea begins to bring them back to shore for days. The note existed. Eisenhower had written it on the night of June 5th, exhausted, so exhausted that he put the date wrong. He said that if something went wrong, it was his own fault. They would have kept him in the word. The political scandal that would have followed the failure of Operation Overlord is hard to overstate. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, was responsible for the operation. He had made the final decision to launch the attack on June 6th after his chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Martin Stagg of the RAF Meteorological Office, informed him of a window of moderate weather between storm systems. The risk was calculated. If June 6th was the window and the window failed, Eisenhower was the one who had chosen it. There is something else that reinforces the inevitability of his resignation. In the months leading up to Overlord, Eisenhower had had serious tensions with Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He had threatened not once but twice to return to the United States if he was not granted greater operational authority. The relationship between the two men, while functional, was never comfortable. Churchill had favoured a different strategy until the last moment, attacking the Axis from southern Europe through what he called the soft belly of the crocodile, in direct reference to the Balkans and the Mediterranean. Eisenhower was the American architect of Overlord. Churchill was its most prominent skeptic among the Allies. With failure in hand, there would have been no possible defence. What followed Eisenhower's resignation was even more corrosive to the Allied command structure. General George Catlett Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army and Eisenhower's mentor, had supported Overlord unreservedly from the beginning. Marshall was the second name on the list of possible Supreme Commanders before Roosevelt chose Eisenhower. A defeat of this magnitude would have also weakened his position, and with it, that of the wing of the American General Staff that believed in a direct approach against Europe. The generals of the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur among them, who never hid his conviction that the Pacific theater was the main effort, would have found in the Normandy disaster the ultimate argument for redistributing resources to their operations. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was facing elections in November 1944, 4 months after the disaster. In reality, He won his fourth term comfortably, although he was already noticeably deteriorated in health. The swelling under his eyes, the greyish colour of his skin, and the weight he had lost alarmed those who frequented him. The Navy doctors who treated him during that period knew that the president was dying. What they didn't know was how much time he had left. Even with the failure of Normandy, Roosevelt remained a war president with a solid base of popular support. The figure who had pulled the country out of the Great Depression with the New Deal and who had unified the nation after Pearl Harbor. The historical precedents of incumbent presidents during active conflicts favored his re-election. But the margin would have been much narrower. Thomas E. Dewey, the governor of New York and Republican candidate who had already been buried by the press of almost the entire nation as a losing candidate before the elections, would have capitalized on the catastrophe with more political agility than the Democrats expected of him. In key states such as Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, where families from the divisions that had landed in Normandy lived, the vote might have swung differently. The most significant effect would not have been 1944, but 1948. Roosevelt, whose health deteriorated until his death on April 12, 1945, would have left the presidency in the hands of his Vice President Harry S. Truman anyway. But a Truman coming to power in the shadow of Normandy's failure over the Democratic administration, rather than V.E. Day's victory, would have been a politically and morally weakened Truman from day one. Their leadership capital, which in reality came largely from managing the victorious final stretch of the war, would not exist. Dewey, who in reality lost the 1948 election by one of the narrowest margins of the 20th century, despite the Chicago Tribune mistakenly proclaiming him the winner in its early morning edition, would have had a much stronger political platform. The decision to use the atomic bombs on Japan, which in reality was Truman's, could have fallen on a moderate Republican president with a different strategic vision. And everything that came after, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the policy of containing communism, would have started from completely different premises. The British economy had been in a position of total war for 5 years. Exports had collapsed. Imports depended on American supplies across the North Atlantic, a route threatened by German submarines well into 1943. London had been bombed during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, and by the summer of 1944, the city was under attack again. This time by V-1 flying bombs, jet-propelled missiles that crossed the Channel at 640 kilometers per hour and fell where they fell with no possibility of precise defense. Later came the V-2, the ballistic rocket that traveled at more than 5,000 kilometers per hour and against which there was no possible defense. Churchill had said sometime in 1944 that Britain was running in fumes. It was an honest description. The failure of Normandy was not only a military defeat, it was a psychological blow for a nation that had been holding on for 4 years with the promise that one day they would cross the Channel. That promise would have been broken, and the question that no one wanted to ask out loud would have resonated in every pub, in every factory, in every house with an empty chair at the table. Is there a way to win this? Churchill had answers. None of them were comforting. The first option was the continuation of the air strategy. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Travers Harris, popularly known as Bomber Harris, had been arguing for years that the strategic bombing of German cities could alone bend the will of the Reich. Attacks by the RAF and USAAF had turned cities such as Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden and Frankfurt into fields of ruins. In a single attack on Hamburg in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah created a firestorm that killed between 35,000 and 40,000 civilians and left more than 1 million people homeless. But Germany had not given up. Not with Hamburg, not with the rest. German war production, under the direction of Armaments Minister Albert Speer, continued to grow until 1944. The Germans had adapted their industry, dispersed it, buried it underground. Cities were burning and factories were still producing. Bomber Harris was right that the bombing caused enormous damage. He was wrong that that damage alone was enough to win. without a second front in northern France, without the relief that Overlord would have brought to the Eastern Front. The only certainty was that time was still ticking, and with each passing week, V-1 and V-2 rockets kept falling on London. On the 6th of July 1944, exactly 1 month after the actual D-Day, Churchill wrote a 4-page minute marked "Very Secret," addressed to General Sir Hastings Ismay, Chief of Staff of the Ministry of Defence. The operational target was the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The document began, "I want you to think very seriously about this poison gas issue." He continued, "It is absurd to consider morality in this issue when everyone used it in the last war without any complaint from moralists or the church. On the other hand, in the last war, the bombing of open cities was considered prohibited. Now everyone does it as a matter of course." And later, in the same document, "He should be prepared to do anything that strikes the enemy in a deadly place. I may certainly have to ask them to support me in the use of poison gas. We could soak the cities of the Ruhr and many other cities in Germany, and if we do, let's do it 100%. The Joint Chiefs of Staff rejected the proposal. The Chiefs of Staff did not rule it out on moral terms, as Churchill himself had anticipated in his minutes, but on concrete strategic considerations. They feared that Germany would respond on an equal or greater scale. By the time that answer came, Britain would not be in a position to absorb a massive exchange of gases. Their stocks were substantial. Britain had produced, during the war, 40,719 tons of mustard gas and 14,042 tons of phosgene and tear gas, according to War Ministry records. But the German defenders had access to something that the Allies were still completely ignorant of. Churchill was not convinced. He replied that the matter should be kept under review and that it would be raised again when things get worse. The July 6, 1944, minutes were reproduced in the August-September 1985 issue of American Heritage magazine, where historian Barton J. Bernstein of Stanford University analyzed it in detail. It was not a hypothetical document. It was real. Now, in the scenario of the failure of Normandy, that minute does not arrive in July 1944 with the tone of a desperate proposal made by a man for whom the war was actually going reasonably well. It arrives, at most, a few weeks earlier, when the situation has no conventional escape valve. And it comes without the implicit argument that the Chiefs of Staff could wield in reality, that the war was being won by other means, that gas was not necessary. The second dimension of the British response was the programme that slept in the Porton Down depots. At the Porton Down facility in Wiltshire, the British government's Biological and Chemical Research Unit had been developing Operation Vegetarian since 1942. Led by microbiologist Paul Fildes, the programme had produced by the spring of 1944 5 million flaxseed cakes infected with spores of Bacillus anthracis, the causative agent of anthrax. The dispersal technique was simple in its brutality. Modified RAF bombers would fly over the pasture areas of northern and western Germany, dropping 400 cakes every 2 minutes during a 20-minute cycle. With 12 planes, each mission would distribute 48,000 cakes. The reserves were enough to repeat the operation for weeks. The evidence on Gruinar Island, off the northwest coast of Scotland, had been unequivocal. In July 1942, an anthrax bomb detonated to windward of 60 sheep tied in a row killed all the animals in a few days. When a subsequent storm swept infected carcasses onto the Scottish mainland, the chain of contagion among coastal livestock took months to control. The island was declared uninhabitable due to anthrax contamination. It remained so for 48 years, until the Ministry of Defence decontaminated it with diluted formaldehyde in 1986, and it was not declared safe until 1990. Churchill, by March 1944, had ordered an additional 500,000 anthrax bombs from the United States, directly from American military laboratories. The order was authorized by the White House. In reality, by the time the bombs were ready in sufficient quantity, the war in Europe was practically won by conventional means, and the operation was shelved. The 5 million flaxseed cakes were incinerated at Porton Down at the end of the war. In the scenario of Normandy's failure, the bombs are ready. And Churchill has the minutes he has already written at hand. The Chiefs of Staff have the same tactical resistance. But what in July 1944 was a proposal that the General Staff was able to reject on the grounds that things are not so bad, a year later, with no second front, with V-2 rockets falling on London from positions that the RAF cannot neutralize, with the Soviet Union advancing alone from the east and closing any favourable scenario for Britain in the post-war period, things would already be as bad as Churchill had anticipated they could be. The threshold would have been crossed, not necessarily in a single day, not necessarily with a single dramatic decision, but through the same incremental logic that Churchill himself had foreseen when he wrote that the proposal should be kept under review. We must stop here for a moment because what follows is the darkest possible scenario, and it is worth looking at it head-on before considering it. If Churchill had authorized the use of chemical or biological weapons against Germany, the Germans would have responded. The estimates of the Allied intelligence services were clear in this regard. By 1945, Germany had accumulated an estimated stock of between 70,000 and 80,000 tons of chemical weapons, including lethal agents such as tabun, sarin and soman, the so-called nerve gases, developed by the chemist Gerhard Schrader between 1936 and 1944. Tabun, synthesized in 1936 and produced in more than 12,000 metric tons at the De Herrnfurth an der Oder plant, was so superior to mustard gas from World War I that it would have completely changed the equation. The Luftwaffe accumulated 500,000 gas bombs in its tanks. Churchill's chiefs of staff knew this. That is why they rejected the proposal in July 1944. The risk of escalating to an exchange of weapons of mass destruction between powers with enormous capabilities was too high. German retaliation would have fallen on Britain and possibly on the Soviet Union. But Churchill had written, "It must be done 100%. And without the pressure to moderate that a war won by conventional means exercised, the threshold of what seemed necessary would have dropped dramatically. The hypothetical exchange of chemical weapons between Britain and Germany in 1945, in this scenario, would have produced civilian and military casualties of a magnitude that the minds of the day could scarcely conceive. Germany had enough nerve gas stores to cause millions of deaths. Britain had enough anthrax spores to contaminate entire regions for decades. The Soviet Union, which also possessed substantial chemical arsenals, would have had to make decisions about retaliation of its own if German agents fell on its lines. There are three possibilities in this scenario: a ceasefire negotiated before the exchange reached its point of no return, a Soviet victory taking advantage of the mutual weakening of Britain and Germany to expand their influence over a devastated continent, or simply an escalation with no clear endpoint, with parts of northern Germany and parts of Britain uninhabitable for decades. None is a good result. Let's back up. Let us forget for now the scenario of weapons of mass destruction, because there is another possibility that deserves a more detailed analysis. If Normandy fails, the Allies are not without options. They have another, the plan that Churchill always preferred before Roosevelt convinced him to bet on northern France. The Prime Minister had argued for years that the best way to hit the Reich was to attack from the south, across the Mediterranean and the Balkans. He called it the soft belly of the crocodile, the shaft, although the phrase remained in simplified history as the soft belly of Europe. The reasoning had a respectable strategic logic. Attack the Axis at its most vulnerable, cut off the Romanian and Hungarian oil supplies that fed the German armoured divisions, and establish Western positions in Central Europe before the Red Army arrived. Stalin hated this plan. He had said it bluntly, both in Tehran in November 1943 and in any communication where the subject came up. The Soviet premier knew perfectly well that an Allied invasion of the Balkans implied a Western presence in what he considered its natural sphere of influence in the post-war period. Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Austria, all this was part of the geopolitical space that the Soviet Union had reserved for itself as compensation for the bloodshed. In the real world, Operation Dragoon, The Allied landing in southern France that took place on August 15, 1944, was overwhelmingly successful precisely because the Wehrmacht had withdrawn most of its forces from the south to meet the advance from Normandy. Without that factor, without successful overlord, the south of France was still defended. Dragoon would have been a very different battle, and possibly a failure as well. But the Balkans were a different scenario. Italy had already been conquered in its most accessible positions. Rome fell on June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day, and the advance from the peninsula northward, albeit slow by successive German defensive lines, provided a logistical base from which an eastward turn was feasible. The forces of Field Marshal Sir Henry Maitland Wilson, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean, had the ability to scout a flank into Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia since 1941, Marshal Josip Broz Tito commanded a partisan movement that by 1944 was the most effective in all of occupied Europe. Tito's partisans had immobilized more than 15 German divisions in Yugoslav territory. An Allied force arriving from the south would have found in Tito an ally of the first magnitude. But he would also have encountered, advancing from the east, the Soviet divisions of Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin, whose Third Ukrainian Front reached the eastern border of Yugoslavia in September 1944. The collision between Western and Soviet forces in the heart of the Balkans would have been the most serious Allied crisis of the war. The clash would not necessarily have been armed, but it would have been politically devastating, and its depth depended on how long the war lasted. Roosevelt never shared Churchill's enthusiasm for the Balkans. He had made this clear since the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, where the Americans pushed for a direct invasion of France that same year. General George Marshall described Churchill's Mediterranean strategy as a path to an endless swamp. And in Tehran, in November 1943, Roosevelt aligned himself with Stalin to definitively close the debate in favor of overlord. The American president was wary of what he saw as British strategic imperialism. Churchill wanting to secure positions in the eastern Mediterranean to protect the routes to India and preserve the empire. Roosevelt wanted to end the war, not to gain positions on the colonial chessboard. Without overlord as a focus of unity, without the shared success that forged the cohesion of the Western Alliance in the months of July to December 1944, when American forces broke through the Norman Bocage front and advanced 600 kilometers in 6 weeks, the differences of vision between Washington and London would have emerged in all their virulence. The most likely trigger would have been the decision of what to do with the remaining American resources. At the time of the failure of Normandy, General Douglas MacArthur was consolidating positions in New Guinea and preparing the assault on the Philippines. Admiral Chester Nimitz had just captured Saipan in the Mariana Islands, putting the B-29 superfortresses within bombing range of the Japanese islands for the first time in the war. The War of the Pacific was advancing. If the European theatre seemed like a swamp with no way out, the logic of concentrating efforts where victories came, the Pacific would have had an enormous weight on the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. A reduction in American engagement in Europe, even partial, would have significantly slowed any Allied advances in the Balkans. The supply lines from the Italian ports, Naples, Taranto, Brindisi, to the Yugoslav interior were already complicated. The Dinaric Alps, a mountain system with passes ranging from 1,200 to 1,800 meters in altitude, with narrow mountain roads and no adequate railway infrastructure, do not spare logistics planners. Without American trucks, without American fuel, without the US industrial apparatus behind every tactical decision, the advance would have become an exercise of will on hostile terrain. The supplies that actually sustained Patton's advance through France, at times his Third Army consumed more than 400,000 gallons of fuel a day, would have had to be redeployed to a theatre where the roads were worse and the enemy easier to defend. And then there was the political problem of Yugoslavia itself. Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav partisan commander, had built his legitimacy on two simultaneous pillars: The struggle against the German occupation and the armed confrontation with the Chetniks of General Dragoljub Mihailović, the Serbian monarchist forces that at times collaborated tactically with the Italian occupiers to fight the communists. Tito was not a man who would accept anyone's tutelage. He would demonstrate this with Stalin himself in 1948 when he broke with Moscow and founded the non-aligned Communist Strand. By 1944, however, the Red Army's physical presence on its eastern borders would have considerably reduced that margin of independence. The British had financed and supplied Tito since 1943, when Captain F.W.D. Deakin parachuted into partisan territory and returned with the report that Tito's communists were militarily much more effective than Mihailovic's monarchists. Churchill, despite his anti-communist instinct, accepted pragmatism. If Tito was the one who killed Germans, Tito was the ally. But in the scenario of the failure of Normandy, with the Red Army reaching eastern Yugoslav before the Western allies from the south, the relationship between Tito and the Soviets would have had a different character, more of a dependency than a lateral alliance. Soviet logistical support would have arrived before British support. The political debt would have been different. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to advance in the north. Operation Bagration of June to August 1944, which in our reality destroyed the German Army Group Center with losses of 350,000 to 400,000 soldiers and advanced the front more than 600 kilometers in less than 2 months, would have happened anyway. Bagration was possible because Soviet superiority in materiel, doctrine and command was already so great by the summer of 1944 that the secondary factor of the Normandy Western Front had little influence on the pace of advance. What Overlord added to Bagration was the German inability to move divisions from west to east to contain the break. Without Overlord, Germany would have been able to move perhaps 5 or 6 additional divisions eastward, insufficient to change Bagration's result, but capable of delaying it by several weeks. Those weeks would not have changed the final outcome. They would have changed the speed at which the Red Army reached the Oder, and with it, the Soviet negotiating position at any subsequent peace conference. The scenario that emerges is this: Soviets reaching the Vistula and the Oder in the autumn of 1944, advancing into Poland and the Baltics, while the Western Allies were slowly moving north from Yugoslavia. The race to Berlin, which the Red Army would win handily in any case, Stalin had promised himself since Stalingrad, would have ended with a time difference of months, not weeks. Germany would have fallen anyway, but when it fell, the western half of the continent would have had only one army within its borders. The result in Europe would have produced a map that no Western strategist wanted to see, the occupation zones agreed upon at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, which in reality divided Germany into 4 sectors, with the initial front roughly on the Elbe, a river that American forces crossed in April 1945, about 150 kilometers from Berlin, without advancing further because of Eisenhower's deliberate decision not to compete with the Soviets for the capital, would have been replaced by a radically different partition if the Soviets reached Berlin alone, with Britain and the United States still south of the Alps or barely across the borders of Austria and Hungary from the Adriatic. The border between the Western and Eastern blocs would have been much farther west. How much further west is the question that no map can answer accurately, because it would depend on negotiations between exhausted and distrustful powers. But there are some solid lines of analysis. First, the Rhine. The Rhine River forms the natural border between the Ruhr industrial area, the most productive in Germany, and the rest of the country. A Soviet Union that had occupied all of Germany up to the Rhine would have had in its hands the Ruhr's coal and steel plants, the shipyards in the north, the ports of Bremen and Hamburg, and the industrial fabric that was, in reality, the engine of West German reconstruction in the 1950s. Without that fabric, the post-war German economic miracle would not have existed. Without the Federal Republic of Germany as the industrial anchor of Western Europe, the Marshall Plan, the $13 billion that the United States pumped into European reconstruction between 1948 and 1952 would have had a much smaller territory and an incomparably smaller impact. The division of Berlin would not have existed in the form we know. There would have been no West Berlin as an Allied island on Soviet territory. The entire city would have been Soviet, which would have eliminated one of the most tense episodes of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949, but also one of the most powerful symbols of Western resistance to Soviet expansion. Secondly, France. Without the liberation of France from Normandy, and with an alternative liberation arriving belatedly from the south or as a collateral consequence of the German defeat in the east, the French internal political map would have been completely different. The French Communist Party, the PCF, was by 1944 the best structured organization of the resistance. His paintings had died in Gestapo prisons. Its clandestine structures were the only ones that functioned with military discipline in all of occupied France. In a scenario where liberation did not come quickly, and with the backing of General Charles de Gaulle's provisional government, which entered Paris on August 26, 1944 in the real world, ensuring republican legitimacy in the face of communism before it could consolidate its own power. The PCF would have arrived at the period 1945 to 1946 with a much stronger internal political position. The American historian Forrest Pogue, in his work Command Decisions, accurately noted that the political leaders of the United States had formulated no policy to confront an aggressive Soviet Union in Central Europe, and no policy directive was ever issued to General Eisenhower by his American superiors or by the combined American-British Joint Chiefs of Staff. That absence of politics was already a problem in the real world. In the scenario of the failure of Normandy, with no Western Allied army on French soil to anchor the political narrative, the gap between Soviet strategic will and Western indecision would have been even more dramatic. Thirdly, the Nordic countries. Norway, with 220,000 German troops in garrison who in reality surrendered peacefully, would have been left in political limbo after the German defeat in the east. No Western Allied forces in Northern Europe to ensure an orderly transition, and with the Soviet Union just across the border from Finland. Stalin had expressed since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact his interest in controlling the Danish Straits and dominating the Baltic. With the Western army stuck in the Balkans and no penetration into the north of the continent, Norway and Denmark would have been accessible political targets. Fourthly, and here is perhaps the most structural consequence, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was founded in April 1949 with 12 founding members, articulated around the American military presence in Western Europe and focused on the defense of West Germany, France, the Benelux countries, and the northern and southern flanks. Without a viable West Germany, without France as a stable democratic power, without a demarcation line at the heart of the continent, NATO would have been an oceanic alliance, Great Britain, Portugal, Iceland, possibly Spain, with no continental strategic depth. An alliance capable of defending the Atlantic coasts, incapable of projecting deterrence to the interior of Europe. And that, perhaps, was exactly what Stalin had wanted all along. In Norway, Germany maintained a garrison of approximately 220,000 troops in 1945, a force that capitulated peacefully at the end of the war in Europe without having fought on any active front during the last years of the conflict. In Sweden, neutrality was maintained at the expense of huge concessions to the Reich. The Swedes allowed German troops to transit during the invasion of Norway in 1940 and supplied high-quality iron to the German war industry during much of the conflict. In the scenario of Normandy's failure, with the war dragging on until 1946 or 1947 and the Red Army dominating the front, the Soviet Union would have had a direct strategic interest in Scandinavia. Access to the North Atlantic and control of the Baltic had been explicit Soviet objectives since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. In the secret territorial division of that pact, the Soviet Union had expressed its interest in control of the Danish Straits and domination of the Baltic. With the Western army stuck in the Balkans and no penetration into the north of the continent, Norway and Denmark would have been accessible political targets. Sweden and Finland, neutral or in the position of Finland that had signed peace with the USSR in September 1944 after the so-called Continuation War, would have seen the influence of the local communist parties grow rapidly. in a context in which the Soviet Union was emerging as the dominant power in continental Europe. The pressure on the governments in Helsinki and Stockholm to align themselves with Moscow would have been formidable. Now, Japan. The entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War on August 8, 1945, was one of the factors that precipitated the Japanese surrender. In the real world, the Soviets broke the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 and launched Operation Storm in August, conquering Manchuria, North Korea, and the Kuril Islands in less than 2 weeks. The operation not only destroyed the Kwantung Army, Japan's largest remaining ground force, with more than 700,000 troops, but ended Japan's last hope of negotiating a conditional surrender with Soviet mediation. A high-ranking Japanese admiral, whose testimony was collected in the post-war interrogations of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, described the combination of the atomic bombs and the Soviet declaration of war as divine gifts, because they allowed the Japanese government to claim that they had been defeated by extraordinary external forces rather than admit collapse from within. But in our alternative scenario, the Soviets would have been deeply occupied in Europe until 1946 or 1947. With the European front unresolved and the full weight of the Soviet war effort concentrated to the west, the declaration of war on Japan would have been postponed or carried out with much smaller forces. The direct consequence would have been that the war in the Pacific, which was itself fundamentally American, would have been even more so. The United States would have liberated the Philippines without Soviet competition in negotiations over the surrounding islands. Mainland China, without the umbrella of Soviet protection from northern Manchuria, that in reality allowed Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party to reorganize and rearm, would have seen a different balance in the resumption of civil war with Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang nationalists. The People's Republic of China, proclaimed on October 1, 1949, might never have existed in that form. And without Communist China, the Korean War of 1950 to 1953 would have had completely different dynamics. The domino that fell in Normandy on June 6, 1944, did not stop bouncing for decades. There is one dimension that is usually relegated in these analyses: France. In the real world, the liberation of Paris came on August 25, 1944, just 80 days after the Normandy landings. General Charles de Gaulle entered the capital on 26 August, thus ensuring the legitimacy of the provisional government of the French Republic in the face of any rival pretensions, including the maneuvers of the French communists, who had also played a central role in the resistance. The speed of liberation was crucial to France's post-war political stability. Without Normandy, France remains occupied in the autumn of 1944. And a France that is still occupied in the final stretch of the war is a France where post-war calculations are completely rewritten. The Mouvement de Libération Nationale and the communist organizations of the Résistance Française had coordinated their activities under the nominal authority of the National Council of the Resistance, created in May 1943. The PCF, the French Communist Party, was by 1944 the best organized political party of the resistance. Their credential was blood. Their cadres had fought, died, and filled the Gestapo prisons with a discipline that the other parties could not match. The very popular name of those shot by the Germans in the French squares, les fusillés, was mostly associated with communist militants. The legitimacy that this generated was real and had electoral weight. In a scenario where the liberation of France comes later, possibly from the south through Mediterranean ports or as a direct consequence of the German defeat on the Eastern Front, with the Red Army already on the Rhine when the Germans finally withdraw their garrisons from France, political power within the resistance would have been much more concentrated in communist hands. The possibility of the PCF emerging as the dominant force in France in 1946 to 1947 was real. It does not mean that France had become a popular democracy in the style of Poland or Bulgaria, because French political culture and the American presence in the Western Mediterranean would have acted as a counterweight. But it does mean that the French Fourth Republic, already in reality politically fragile and paralyzed by government coalitions, would have had a parliamentary geometry even more difficult to manage. The role of Charles de Gaulle also changes. In reality, de Gaulle built his authority on a single pillar, having been the voice of Free France when all was lost and having entered Paris before anyone else could dispute the symbolic capital of triumph. That moment on August 26, 1944, on the Champs-Élysées, with bullets still whistling over the crowd as he walked with his inordinate height towards Notre Dame, was irreplaceable as a founding act. Without Normandy, that act doesn't happen that way. De Gaulle arrives late, or arrives dependent on another actor, or arrives when the act of liberation already has other protagonists. His post-war authority would have been of a different order. The colonial empires of Britain and France would also have operated under distinct premises, and here the divergence from our timeline is especially pronounced. Roosevelt had been explicit throughout the war. The British Empire and the French Empire had to be dismantled in the post-war period. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Churchill and Roosevelt in August 1941, even before the American entry into the war, affirmed in its third principle the right of peoples to choose their form of government. Churchill attempted to restrict its application to countries under Axis occupation. Roosevelt did not give him that satisfaction. At the Cairo and Tehran conferences in November and December 1943, Roosevelt again insisted decolonization was part of the new world order that the United States was building. But American pressure on the colonial issue depended, ultimately, on the degree to which Britain and France needed the American ally. A Britain that was going into the post-war period without the triumph of Normandy under its belt, more dependent on American support to contain Soviet expansion in Europe, would have had less room to resist Washington's decolonization pressure. But at the same time, it would have had a greater incentive to cling to its colonies. With the metropolis economically devastated by a longer war, the resources of India, Malaysia, West Africa, and the Caribbean were even more needed than in reality to finance reconstruction. The tension between these two forces, greater American pressure to decolonize and greater British need to maintain the empire, would have produced a more conflictive, not more orderly colonial process. India would have achieved independence anyway. The Indian National Congress had the political and social critical mass to obtain it regardless of what happened in Europe. Nehru and Gandhi did not need Normandy to achieve what they did. But the process would have been more harrowing, with Britain less willing to budge because its finances were more compromised, and possibly with more violence in transit. The case of French Indochina is even more revealing. In reality, France regained control of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in 1945, held it during 8 years of war against Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, and was definitively expelled after the defeat of Dien Bien Phu in May 1954. That process, which cost 75,000 French deaths and an incalculable number of Vietnamese, led directly to the American intervention that determined the second half of the 20th century in Southeast Asia. In the scenario of the failure of Normandy, with France politically more unstable, more dependent on its colonies economically, and with the PCF having greater influence in the government, French colonial policy would have been even more contradictory. The French communist left had anti-colonial positions in principle, but when the independence of the colonies threatened the economic interests that also benefited French workers in industries linked to the empire, the principle gave way to pragmatism. The archives of the PCF in the period of the actual Indochina War show exactly that tension. In the alternative scenario, with the PCF stronger, that tension would have been more visible and less resolvable. Morocco and Tunisia, French protectorates that in reality achieved independence in 1956, after relatively orderly negotiations driven in part by American pressure, would have remained under French control for longer, but in a more fragile way. The debt that France owed to the Moroccan fighters of the Army of Africa, which in reality had been decisive in Italy's campaigns, would have been a greater debt and more difficult to ignore. Sultan Mohammed ben Youssef, who was in reality deposed by the French in 1953 and returned triumphantly in 1955 as Mohammed V, would have had a different margin for negotiation depending on how much France needed its colonial troops in a more protracted European conflict. And at the bottom of all this was the point that Churchill had privately acknowledged, and that few wanted to state clearly, that the British Empire was incompatible with the world that would emerge from a war won with American support. In reality, Churchill knew this and reluctantly accepted it. In the alternative scenario, with a weaker and more dependent Britain, the surrender would have had to be faster or more violent. There was no sustainable middle ground. Without the industrious base of liberated Western Europe, without northern France, without the Benelux countries, without rebuilt West Germany, the community that Churchill had once imagined as the United States of Europe would have lacked its most productive pieces. What would have been left would be, at best, an Atlantic confederation of diminished powers, navel-gazing at each other while the continent east of the Alps operated under other rules. There is one element that transforms all the calculations of this scenario, and that deserves its own treatment: the Manhattan Project. On July 16, 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico, the Manhattan Project detonated its first successful nuclear test, known as the Trinity Test. 3 weeks later, on August 6th, the uranium bomb called Little Boy destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki. In the scenario of the failure of Normandy, the Manhattan Project would have continued according to its own schedule, which depended on advances in uranium-235 enrichment and plutonium production at the Hanford, Washington reactors. The technical calendar does not change with the defeat on the Normandy beaches. What changes is the decision about how and against whom to use the weapon. In reality, the debate within the Provisional Committee that advised Truman on the use of the bomb was intense. Some scientists, including physicist Leo Szilard, circulated a petition signed by 70 Manhattan Project researchers requesting that Japan receive a prior demonstration of the weapon before using it over a city. The request was ignored. In our alternative scenario, with the war in Europe still unresolved in the summer of 1945, with the Soviet Union moving toward ever-widening control of the continent, with Britain exhausted, and with the risk of an exchange of chemical or biological weapons on the horizon, the availability of a nuclear weapon would have changed the entire strategic dynamic. The question that no one wants to ask: would the Americans have considered using the weapon against Germany? In the real world, when the bomb was ready, Germany had already capitulated. The weapon was originally developed for use against Germany. The Allied nuclear fear had begun with the German atomic program, the Uranverein, led by Werner Heisenberg since 1939. It was Germany that was the original target. When Germany capitulated, the target was Japan. In the scenario where the war in Europe continues until 1946, the possibility that the first nuclear bomb used in combat fell on a German, not Japanese city exists. The cities of the industrial Rhine Basin, Berlin, Munich, the already razed Dresden itself, are plausible targets. The consequences of that decision for the post-war period would have been incalculable. The occupation of a partially irradiated Germany, the psychology of a nation crushed not only by defeat but by atomic annihilation, the precedent that nuclear weapons had been used on European soil, and the Soviets, who knew about the program through their spies within the Manhattan Project, Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, David Greenglass, would have accelerated their own nuclear development with even greater urgency. In reality, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949. In this scenario, with the added incentive of a nuclear Germany on the horizon, and with the enormous human capital of German physicists captured in the Soviet zone, it could have done so sooner. By 1950, in this alternate history, the political map of Europe would be unrecognizable. The Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill described in his speech in Fulton, Missouri, on March 5, 1946, From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has fallen over the continent. This would have been drawn 500 or 700 kilometers further west. West Berlin, Hamburg, Düsseldorf, Frankfurt, perhaps Munich. All these cities could have been east of the line. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, would have existed as well, probably centered on the Atlantic coasts. Britain, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, perhaps northern Italy. A defensive alliance built around the ocean rather than around the continent. The Marshall Plan, the American Reconstruction Program for Western Europe, would have had a much smaller geography, although the American incentives to prevent the European economic disaster from creating fertile soil for communism remained the same. France, in this scenario, was the biggest unknown. Churchill had once thought of a Franco-British Union, a confederation of the two European Atlantic powers that would operate as a third actor in the confrontation between Washington and Moscow. In the most desperate hours of June 1940, before the fall of France, the British War Cabinet went so far as to draft in serious terms a proposal for political union between the two countries. The proposal was buried when Marshal Philippe Pétain formed the Vichy government. A Britain and France that emerged from the war in a position of greater relative vulnerability would have had more powerful reasons to explore formulas for deeper cooperation. The European coal and steel community, the embryo of what became the European Union, was in our reality an initiative led by France and West Germany. In this scenario, without a viable West Germany, the Franco-British axis could have become the core of a different European integration, more limited, more defensive, more imperial in its leanings. Churchill's thought of a united Europe was not federalist in the modern sense. It was the vision of a continental arbiter who preserved the balance of power. Without the massive American presence on European soil that was in reality the result of the post-war period, that vision would have had more room to materialize in some form. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man who in January 1944 had scoured the Normandy beaches and concluded that the Atlantic Wall was a fraud, the man who had argued that the panzer divisions must be within a few hours of the coast in order to be able to counterattack in the first critical hours of the landings, died on October 14, 1944, in a scenario quite far from the battlefield. After the failure of the attempt on Hitler's life on July 20, 1944, Gestapo investigations linked Rommel to the conspirators, although the exact nature of his involvement remains debated among historians. The general was recovering at his home in Herrlingen, Baden-Württemberg, from wounds sustained when his vehicle was strafed by RAF fighters on July 17. Two generals came to his door on October 14 with an offer: suicide and a state funeral with honours, or trial before the People's Court and reprisals against his family. Rommel chose the cyanide pill. The regime announced that he had died of his combat wounds. In the scenario of the failure of Normandy, the attack of July 20th would have occurred as well. Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg had spent years building the conspiracy, regardless of the results on the Normandy beaches. The Allied defeat in Normandy might have given it even more urgency. With the war clearly without an imminent resolution, the regime's internal fractures would have grown. But without the context of a successful Allied landing convincing the military elite that defeat was inevitable, the conspiracy would have had less support among officers hoping for a pretext to join. And so Rommel could have survived a little longer, the man who best understood what it took to defend the Norman coasts, the man who could have changed the outcome if he had had the resources and authority he asked for, would have seen the German defeat slowly consummated from his convalescence without being able to change anything. The Atlantic Wall was 18% of what it promised. It was enough to hold the landing on the night of June 5, 1944, exactly 1 year before the end of a war that ended the same only a year later. In all possible scenarios, in the end, Germany lost. The difference was who won along with her and at what price. General Eisenhower's aide-de-camp, Captain Harry Butcher, found the note a month after the actual D-Day. He rescued it before Eisenhower destroyed it. Today, it rests in the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, in a permanent display case. The note has 67 words. It is dated by mistake on July 5th. It ends with that phrase that Eisenhower never had to utter. "If any fault is attributed to the attempt, it is mine alone." Those 67 words weigh more than they seem. They weighed in Eisenhower's pocket as he looked at the horizon on the night of June 5th. And they weigh now because we know, with the perspective of 8 decades, everything that depended on the fact that I never had to read them. More than 150,000 troops made landfall in Normandy on June 6, 1944. More than 4,000 died on that first day alone, according to US Department of Defense records. Among the highest figures, the estimated 2,400 casualties at Omaha Beach during the first hours. Among those who made it ashore, countless later described the experience in the same terms. Water up to their necks, bodies floating around, the sound of MG-42s that veterans on the Eastern Front described as the tearing of cloth, the utter chaos of the first few minutes. And yet, they crossed. They kept going. They found the steps between the ravines, crawled under the wire, flanked the positions that had nailed them. For sunset, they had a foothold. Small, bloody, precarious. But they did. That's what makes the paper in Eisenhower's pocket so revealing. It does not speak of the heroism of the soldiers, which was real. He speaks of the weight carried by the man who sent those soldiers, knowing perfectly well that he could be sending them to a butcher's shop with no way out, knowing that if things went wrong, he could only say that it was his fault. The alternative history of this document is, in the end, the story of the margin between the world we have and the world that could have been. A margin measured in time, in decisions made seconds before the threshold closed, in waves that broke in a certain way and not another, in German generals who were on the wrong front when they should have been on the right one. That margin had a name, June 6, 1944. June